Despite all these incredibly deep, structural disagreements over the nature, the function, and the timing of the Messiah, both of these traditions are ultimately looking toward the exact same horizon, the final, global redemption of the world. At its core, the word Messiah simply comes from the Hebrew word for anointed one. Back in the Hebrew Bible, it mostly referred to a present, physical, political, or religious leader who was appointed by God, usually a king, sometimes a priest or a prophet. But over centuries, that concept morphed into this expectation of a future, eschatological figure. So the big question we're tackling today is, how did this single root concept completely split and evolve into two entirely separate, highly developed theological paradigms?
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll trace the divergent paths of the Messiah. Then we'll compare the divine versus purely human nature. Contrast the functions of sacrifice versus restore, look at the timing in the Torah, and finally wrap up with some really fascinating alternative models.
Let's get right into it with Section 1, the divergent paths of the Messiah, and the parting of ways.
To really wrap our heads around the theology, we've got to rewind to the 1st century. Both of these traditions actually started as sects of Judaism during the Second Temple period, but a massive catalyst for their split was the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE. Before that traumatic event, there wasn't just one monolithic Judaism. There were all these different sects with incredibly diverse messianic expectations. But in the aftermath of the temple falling, two distinct movements really solidified. The Nazarene movement evolved into Christianity and Messianic Judaism, while the Pharisee movement evolved into Rabbinic Judaism. Because they grew up in completely different contexts after that devastation, each tradition cherished and refined its own very distinct messianic vision.
Moving right along to Section 2, nature, divine versus purely human.
And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast between these two paradigms when we talk about the actual essence of the messianic figure. Messianic Judaism views Jesus as the God-man. We're talking about the enfleshed Word, a literal Son of God, who completely combines both divine and human natures, which includes the belief in a virgin birth. Rabbinic Judaism, on the flip side, expects a strictly human king. In that view, the Messiah is a natural, biological descendant of King David, born through completely normal procreation, absolutely not a divine being.
Now, you might be thinking this is just a minor theological nuance, but it's actually a fundamental friction point. Rabbinic Judaism is entirely anchored in absolute monotheism, the absolute belief in a single, indivisible God. So from the rabbinic perspective, the whole idea of a God-man is categorically rejected. It's viewed as pagan because it's seen as a direct violation of the absolute unity of God.
That brings us to Section 3, function, sacrifice versus restore.
So what is the Messiah actually supposed to do when he gets here? Well, here is another profound divergence. Messianic Judaism focuses primarily on an atoning sacrifice. The Messiah's main job is a vicarious death and resurrection meant to offer humanity salvation from sin and death. It's seen as a finished spiritual work of redemption. Rabbinic Judaism, however, views the Messiah's task as one of national and political restoration. The expectation isn't spiritual salvation from sin, that is strictly God's job. The Messiah's job is the literal, physical liberation of Israel from foreign domination and a tangible, earthly change in the world's political order.
To put that into perspective and see just how physical and political this rabbinic expectation is, let's look at the strict criteria laid out by the great medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides. For Rabbinic Judaism, any claimant has to check every single one of these boxes: be of Davidic descent, gather the Jewish exiles, restore political sovereignty, defeat Israel's physical enemies, rebuild the Holy Temple, and bring actual universal peace to the entire world. Because Jesus didn't achieve these specific political and material goals during his lifetime, Rabbinic Judaism categorically does not recognize him as the Messiah. All right, on to Section 4, timing and the Torah. When it comes to the timeline, it's almost like we're looking at two totally different calendars. Messianic Judaism operates on a two-part timeline. They believe the Messiah has already come once in humility, the first advent, and will return again in glory. They also emphasize being led by the Spirit, often viewing the Messiah's authority as standing completely above traditional human legal structures. Rabbinic Judaism, conversely, is still in a state of expectation for a single future arrival, and crucially, this future Messiah is expected to be a master teacher and a strict observer of the law. His role is to compel all of Israel to perfectly follow the 613 commandments of the Torah.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is a pretty surprising historical fact. In early foundational rabbinic texts like the Mishnah, the Messiah is barely even mentioned. Scholars actually call this intentional silencing a dearth of messiology. After the devastating, catastrophic wars with Rome, the rabbis purposely downplayed apocalyptic messianic fervor. Instead, they hyper-focused on everyday sanctification through the law. The center of their entire theology became the Torah and daily commandments, not an urgent, frantic wait for an end-time savior.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Alternative Models and Waiters. So up to this point, the lines seem pretty rigidly drawn, right? Well, esoteric traditions actually offer some incredible alternative models. For instance, there's this fascinating concept in rabbinic literature known as Messiah ben Yosef. This is a bifurcated or two-part Messiah model. Messiah ben Yosef is a warrior from the tribe of Ephraim who is literally destined to suffer and die in battle against the forces of evil. His death is what paves the way for the ultimate, victorious Messiah ben David. So interestingly enough, the concept of a suffering, dying messianic figure definitely does exist within rabbinic thought. It's just framed in a totally different context.
Let's move to and see how this builds. You've got these very distinct eras. First, a period of intense turmoil, often called birth pangs. Then, the arrival of that first Messiah who actually dies in battle, followed eventually by the triumphant arrival of the second Messiah. Some modern Jewish thinkers have looked at this exact framework and suggested it could provide a traditional Jewish theological space to understand Jesus. Not as the ultimate Davidic king who brings world peace, but perhaps as a penultimate figure who suffered.
This naturally leads to a really crucial distinction, one made by modern scholars like Yitz Greenberg. It's the difference between a false Messiah and a failed one. A false Messiah promotes the wrong values and opposes the covenant entirely. But a failed Messiah, that's someone who upholds the right values and the covenant, but just happens to die before completing Maimonides' massive geopolitical checklist. Greenberg suggests that the tragedy of history and centuries of severe external persecution caused the rabbinic world to label Jesus a false Messiah rather than just a failed one, like other well-meaning Jewish figures who died before achieving that final redemption.
So the crucial point is beautifully captured in this quote from our sources. Despite all these incredibly deep, structural disagreements over the nature, the function, and the timing of the Messiah, both of these traditions are ultimately looking toward the exact same horizon, the final, global redemption of the world.